Hi everyone. I'm not here today, but we're going to keep on schedule with our notes. So today we're going to do all the notes on Chapter 6, the environment. Specifically, we're going to talk about how humans have affected the environment. So first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, and then we're going to get into the environmental issues the world is currently facing. So let's start with the background. Way before the Industrial Revolution or even the Agricultural Revolution, you were looking at an Earth that only had 5 million people on it. So we're talking about small groups of nomadic people that lived off the land and didn't really have that big of an impression on the environment because they were kind of just like animals are today. So you could only fit so many people and the environment could only support so many people. And so our effect on the environment itself was minimal. Okay, now let's fast forward till today. We've had the Agricultural Revolution, then we moved on to the Industrial Revolution, and even our current technological revolution. And today, long story short, we have over 11 billion people. And the only reason we've been able to get that big is because we now have better food supplies, we have these big agricultural farms and fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, and so we've really been able to step up food production, and we've improved sanitation so that we have someplace to put the waste of most of these people so that we're not dying of cholera, and we also have better medical care. So whereas the average lifespan 10,000 years ago was probably in your late 20s, early 30s, the average lifespan now is somewhere between 78 to 82, and they think in the next 20 years or so, we're going to be up to 100, most of us. So that's good, but unfortunately, we've taken all of the resources the Earth has to offer to sustain 11 billion people. And so there's two different kinds of resources. The first type are renewable resources. So renewable resources are resources that we can replace at the same rate at which we consume them. And so this picture here is of bamboo trees. And here's some bamboo. And bamboo will actually grow up to 6 feet in a week. And you can use this bamboo and you can make bamboo flooring. So bamboo flooring works just like hardwood flooring does, except instead of taking 30 years for that tree to grow, we can get bamboo in just a few weeks. So bamboo becomes a much better renewable resource. Now the other type of resources are, not surprisingly, called non-renewable. And non-renewable resources form way slower than the rate at which we're using them. And so non-renewable resources typically fall in the category of fossil fuels. And so we call them fossil fuels because they are literally made of prehistoric plant matter. So things the dinosaurs didn't eat were covered up, eventually turned into this lovely black goo we call oil, and then we pumped it out millions and millions of years later. Now, we take this oil and we use it to make gasoline and home heating oil, but we also use it to make plastics and other components of things that we use every day. So we're using these non-renewable resources a lot faster than they're obviously being created because we don't have a million years to wait around for our new cell phone. So we've taken these renewable and non-renewable resources and we've used them at the point now where we are causing serious damage to our environment. So that damage is actually starting to affect the health of the human race. So we have incredible amounts of pollution, specifically from these fossil fuels and other things, and we're also destroying habitat. We cut down trees, we pump out oil and pollute the ground and pollute the water, and we then burn things or manufacture things. And so basically the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat are all impacted by this pollution and habitat destruction. And so now we're going to try to get into these environmental issues more in depth. And so let's start in the sky and work our way down. So let's start with air pollution. Air pollution is not surprisingly caused by human activities. Specifically, industry and power plants and cars we drive burn those fossil fuels to move. So we get energy from the internal combustion engine. And the waste products of burning those fossil fuels are carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides. And so these three things are present in really small amounts, usually, but we're adding exceptional amounts of these to our environment every day. In fact, in March, we had the highest carbon dioxide concentrations on record for the last 2 million years. So what happens because of this air pollution, because of putting these things into the environment? Well, there's a lot of different effects. And so the first one is acid rain. So when you add sulfuric and nitric oxides and dioxides to the environment, it goes up into the clouds, which are filled with water, and it turns them into acid. And so instead of water falling to the ground, you have sulfuric and nitric acids falling to the ground. And that actually will dissolve parts of buildings. And so if you look at this example from a church in 1908, you can clearly see that this is a figure that was carved a few hundred years ago. And by 1969, you really can't tell what it is because the acid rain had decimated the look of it. And so acid rain is obviously a really big problem because if it's doing this to rock, think of what it's doing to the ground and the plants and the animals in your rivers and lakes and streams. And so other things that are affected by the acid rain are then going to have kind of a domino effect throughout the ecosystem. Another part of air pollution is global warming. And so global warming is kind of like a two-part problem. The first part is the ozone layer, which is meant to protect us from the radiation from the sun, is damaged. And it's being damaged by things called CFCs for short, which stands for chlorofluorocarbons. And these are found in coolants, in things like refrigerators and air conditioners. It's how we keep stuff cold. And what happens is when we use them, these chlorofluorocarbons get released, and it causes a hole in the ozone layer, so more of these this solar radiation can get through to the Earth's surface. And so now that more of this heat and solar radiation is getting through, we also have other pollutants like our sulfur dioxide and our nitrogen oxides and our soot and particulates and all these things that are actually going to absorb that heat that gets through, and it's going to cause the heat to be trapped near the surface, which is also going to cause the global surface temperature to increase. And we call this increase in global surface temperature the greenhouse effect. And the way the greenhouse effect works is that typically the sun's rays come through, and then we absorb part of them, and the rest of it we re-radiate back out into space. Okay? Now the problem is that the more carbon dioxide we release into the atmosphere, the more that instead of this solar radiation being bounced back into space, the more it gets trapped in the atmosphere and kept close to the Earth. Much like when you use a greenhouse, the sun rays get in, they heat up the air, and then that warm air is trapped in the greenhouse by the glass. And so here's a great picture of how the greenhouse effect is supposed to work versus how it works now. So what is supposed to happen naturally is that some solar radiation makes it to the Earth, and we have a little bit of these greenhouse gases normally, and the greenhouse gases trap a little bit of this solar radiation back to the Earth to keep us warm, but most of it escapes into space. Now that we've added all this extra carbon dioxide and other compounds, they're now trapping more of this heat. So instead of it being re-radiated to space, it gets to all of these greenhouse gases, and then it gets radiated again back to the Earth. So it makes the Earth warmer. Now, there's a lot of effects of global warming besides just having slightly hotter summers and not as cold winters, although after this winter we would tend to disagree with this. It can actually increase the entire Earth temperature. And it has. They figured out the Earth's temperature has gone up about 2 to 3 degrees in the last 100 years as a result of the greenhouse effect. And this increase in temperature may not seem like a whole heck of a lot, but it's causing the ice caps to melt. And the melting ice caps then have fresh water that is melting into salt water. So the salt water and the fresh water actually move differently in the currents of the oceans, and so it's causing a change in weather patterns, as well as obviously more water. The sea levels are rising. So there are islands that people live on that they know if the sea levels keep rising won't be there in 50 years. And while warmer oceans may seem like a good thing when we're going to the beach, Narragansett Bay used to have a healthy flounder population because the flounders would come, and those are those weird little fish with the eyes on the same side of their head, the flat ones. And they would lay their eggs and have their babies in Narragansett Bay. But Narragansett Bay has gone up in temperature 3 degrees. It is now too warm for the flounder to lay their eggs, and so they are going northwards, and our flounder fishing industry has collapsed. So global warming really does have effects. It's going to change where we can grow our food because certain places will become too hot. It's going to change the way temperature and weather work. And so if there's a reason why we got all the snow and California is in its worst drought in 200 years, that's why as well, because they only got 18% of the snow cap that they normally get. So that all their snow ended up on us. Now we're going to move on from air to water. So let's talk about water pollution. Well, water pollution can come from a number of different places. The biggest causes of water pollution are fertilizers and pesticides used in agriculture. And so farmers spray or spread fertilizers and cover their crops in pesticides to keep the bugs away, and then they use too much, and then when it rains, it runs down into the local water supply, into streams and rivers, and eventually out into the ocean. And this increased amount of nitrogen and phosphates will accumulate, and it will cause the plants in the ocean, like algae, to bloom. And so the other problem is livestock farms, things like chicken farms and cow farms. And I'm not talking just a couple, I'm talking the massive kind of farms that you see down south that have thousands and thousands and thousands of animals. Their waste has nowhere to go either, so it essentially gets washed down into the water supply and then once again out into the ocean eventually. There's also industrial waste as part of water pollution, those random pipes that come out of factories straight into a water supply. Industrial pollution could also be heat. So water is brought in as a coolant, and then it's heated up really hot, and then it's released back into the environment way hotter than it should be. Another form of water pollution is oil runoff from roads. And so cars drip oil and gasoline and brake dust and all that stuff. Then at the first rainstorm gets flushed down into storm drains and then down into water streams and rivers and things. And then finally septic tanks, which we all have. The town of Seekonk literally runs on septic tanks. And so septic tanks essentially have holes for liquid matter to leach out into the ground, and bacteria to hopefully eat away the solid matter. And so septic tanks, if they are sitting right over an aquifer, they can obviously contaminate the water. And so water pollution can lead to many problems. And specifically, I want to talk about how water pollution can lead to algae growth. And so these are two pictures. This one shows off the coast of California. This is red algae that is bloomed as a result of excess fertilizer making it into the ocean. And in this picture, all the water is green because it's all algae. You see a little speedboat traveling through it. But this excessive growth of algae is a problem because, first of all, it's not supposed to be there in the amount that it's there. And second of all, once the nutrients run out, this algae dies. And in the process of dying and decomposing, it sucks the oxygen out of the water. Now, the fish need that level of oxygen to breathe. And so, if there is an algae bloom, it's typically followed by a massive fish kill because as the oxygen is taken out of the water, the fish will literally asphyxiate because there's no oxygen left for them to breathe. And so you'll see algae blooms and fish kills more primarily in the summer when things are being grown. Okay, another problem, and this kind of is partly water, partly soil, is soil erosion. So what happens is water will wash away that good topsoil that's essentially not being held down by plants. The other option is if the topsoil is not covered and it's not wet, the wind will actually take it away. And then there are cases for things like mudslides where water may become a factor or it may not, and the soil just literally falls away. But the important part about this topsoil is the topsoil is the layer where all the nutrients are. So the topsoil is the layer we need to produce our food. And so without this fertile soil, what farmers do when the good soil is eroded away is they'll add fertilizers to the poor soil to help the crops grow, and that further creates a problem for our water. So it's like a big vicious cycle. And so there are ways that farmers have figured out to try to fix erosion. And so some of those ways are by changing the way they farm. And so if you ever look at pictures of the Far East and the rice paddies, they will have rice paddies all the way up the side of mountains. And what they figured out is that if instead of growing it on a slope, they actually build up a little wall and then they terrace farm. So it kind of looks like steps, where at each step there's a little patch of farm and then they'll have another step up. And this actually holds the soil there and stops it from eroding down the mountainside. The other option is when the soil is not being used for agricultural crops, they'll plant something there that grows very quickly and kind of covers the soil just for the purposes of holding the soil in place. And that's called a cover crop. And then typically what happens is before they're ready to plant the agricultural product, they just rototill down the cover crop and the nutrients then go back to the soil. Another option is crop rotation, so that they don't deplete the soil and then have to add fertilizers. They'll take a crop like beans, which has nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they will actually, beans put nitrogen back into the soil. And then the next year they'll plant corn in the same place because corn pulls in a lot of nitrogen out of the soil. So by rotating crops and different crops needing different nutrients in different amounts, they can actually cut down on necessary use of fertilizers. And the final one is they do contour plowing. And contour plowing is really cool because instead of just plowing in straight rows, farmers actually use curved rows. Because what happens in straight rows is that the water will flush down the row and just keep moving down until it gets to the end and then drains off. But if you have the rows curved, the water kind of has to stop and it gets stopped by the soil. And so it keeps it from getting that momentum that takes a lot of the topsoil away. So now that we've talked about the three biggies, air, water, and land, let's talk more about how we can actually disrupt all three together, because that's what people are good at, is causing a maximum amount of mess in the minimum amount of effort. So ecosystem disruption. And so we're talking about how entire ecosystems can be disrupted. So the first one is habitat destruction. And our biggest form of habitat destruction is really when we take out things like forest and grassland and wetland and then use the land for our own purposes. Or we use it for the trees themselves. And so in this case, you can look at this. This is a clear-cutting practice, and clear-cutting practices are bad, 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 because they literally just cut in a line and they wipe out all the trees. And they take all the trees to a logging company where it's made into furniture or flooring or the paper you're writing on right now. So habitat destruction is a problem, obviously, because there's a number of organisms who live in that forest. And so for every piece of forest you take out, you're essentially making those organisms all homeless. And you're also taking away their source of food. So the organisms will keep moving on and moving on until they eventually run out of space. And either they will find somewhere else to live or they will just die out. So a lot of the cases of extinction currently during our 6th extinction event are the result of habitat loss. And sometimes species have a very specific niche. They have a very specific place they can live. For example, the spotted owl can only live in old growth forest, which means the trees have to be like 50 years old. And so if you cut down those big old trees, there's very few other places that have the qualifications that that owl needs to survive. So the next is kind of related to the last one, because habitat loss also leads to a loss of biodiversity. And biodiversity is the variety of organisms in a given area. So it's essentially all the different organisms that interact with each other in an ecosystem. So the less biodiversity you have, the less stable the ecosystem. So koala bears only eat eucalyptus trees. And so if you cut down the eucalyptus trees, it's not like koalas can just pick up a different tree and start eating it. So the less biodiversity you have, the less stable an ecosystem. So the more options an organism has for food, the more likely that ecosystem is to maintain homeostasis. But if you take away parts of that biodiversity, if you take away certain organisms, you're actually going to disrupt the entire food web, because if you don't have the right type of grass, then you don't have the herbivores to eat it, and then the carnivores don't have any food. So it becomes a domino effect. Another problem from an ecological and environmental standpoint is invasive species. And invasive species will also disrupt an ecosystem because, number one, they're not supposed to be there. And so they're brought in either on accident or on purpose, and they outcompete the native species. And so in a lot of cases, you'll have frogs or fish or other organisms that aren't supposed to be in one place, but they are actually reproduce faster or are bigger or are better adapted, and so they will outcompete the native species and cause the native species to go through extirpation or even extinction. And also because they don't have natural predators, and they are going to disrupt the entire ecosystem because they're going to eat things they shouldn't eat, and they're not going to be eaten like the native species would. And so invasive species can cause a lot of trouble. And invasive species can lead to our next slide, which is extinction. And so extinction is death of every member of a species. And I think I've told you about this guy before. Here he is, the last male white rhino. Ooh, ah. And he is being guarded by 3 very scary looking men whose job it is to make sure that poachers don't take him down for his horn. Which isn't even that majestic. It's kind of been filed down. But And so what they're trying to do is to take this last male white rhino and get him to reproduce before this entire species becomes extinct. Now, I've talked to you about all the problems that we as humans have created in the environment, and since we were the ones who made the problems, it's only fair that we be the one who fixed them. And so there are some environmental solutions out there. And so the first one is kind of one of my no-duh statements. You need to conserve the habitats we have. And so groups like the Seekonk Land Trust are going to put aside special pieces of land for the purpose of making sure these organisms have some place to live and food to eat. And so you can conserve the habitats we currently have, and then you can restore the habitats that used to be there. So land that is no longer being used, if it used to be a wetland, can be turned back into a wetland because it's a lot more functional as a wetland than it is as a deserted shopping plaza. And so restoration of habitats has become a really big thing to ensure the survival of certain species that only live in very specific areas. And it's also good for the environment because it restores it to homeostasis. This is one that you've been taught since you were very young. You can reduce, reuse, and recycle your resources. So reduction, you can use less, particularly of fossil fuels. Reuse, instead of getting a new phone, you can keep your phone for just a little bit longer. And obviously recycle. It's a lot less of an environmental degradation to recycle an aluminum can than to try to take raw aluminum ore out of the ground. Also, we have technology. So there's a reason why we've been able to keep 11 billion people alive, and that is increases in medical care and increases in food supply and all the other things that we've done to make it so that we can live and live comfortably. And hopefully things that we can do to kind of stop or clean up the messes we've already made. And finally, there's education. And education is important because in a lot of places where these animals are endangered, the people don't understand what it really means for the animals to be endangered. And so they know that while they shouldn't kill that tiger, if they do, it's going to give them money to put food on the table. And so one big push that's been happening lately is ecotourism. And what happens with ecotourism is you explain to the local people, if you kill this animal, you'll get paid once. But if you instead bring tourists in and you give tours showing them that same animal over and over again, you're going to make money over and over again. And so ecotourism has become very important to try to teach local people the benefits of preserving the animals and their environments. And so those are your notes on Chapter 6.